Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking to Ian Lynam. Ian is currently based in Tokyo, where he seems to have his hand in all sorts of projects, ranging from design to writing to curating to teaching to publishing. He runs his own design studio. He teaches at Temple University, Japan, and the Meme Design School, and is chair of VCFA's MFA graphic design program. He writes for magazines like Idea and Slanted and runs Wordshape, which is a sort of boutique type foundry and online shop that sells things like posters, books, and zines and design ephemera. So you can see he's a man who keeps busy. In our conversation, Ian and I talk about his origins working at Kinko's for the easy access to printers so he could make his own zines, to studying at Cal Arts and building his own design practice. We talk about the state of design discourse and the problems with the sort of design writing that you often find on sites like Medium today, as well as the role of design writing in his own practice and how he teaches design theory and encourages writing to his own students. Ian is someone whose work, both as a designer and really just as a thinker, I've really admired for years now. He's just one of those people who I think just gets it and is just incredibly smart and generous and really embodies this idea of design being a type of inquiry, which is an area of deep interest to me. So I think Ian's writing is really unique and needed. So I was really glad we could have this conversation. I know it was illuminating for me and hope it's the same for you. Here is my conversation with Ian Lynam. I've been following your work. I don't even actually know where I kind of first came across your work or your writing, but I've been following your work for a couple years now. It might have been your book, actually, Parting It Out. But I don't actually know much about kind of where you came from or how you got interested in design. And so I thought it would be nice if we started there with just, where did your interest in design start, or how did you become a designer?
Okay. Well, I started, I'm from upstate New York, from a really small town outside of Albany. And I first started making small zines, self-published, independent publications when I was 14 years old. And I didn't realize that it was design, but I was, writing stuff, doing the layout, doing the illustration, but I was much more interested in the concrete aspects, typography, and how everything fit together in terms of a visual narrative.
Right.
At a really young age, but I just wasn't aware that it was design. And I went to school briefly at SUNY Purchase in New York. Realized college wasn't for me at that point. Dropped out, moved to the Bay Area, and just kind of worked at a bunch of odd jobs, including Kinko's, just to have access to free printing.
Right.
And and just continued self-publishing up to a point, and this was like, by that time, I was born in 1972. I'm 44 now.
Okay.
And I was just interested in self-publishing. And during the first dot-com boom, or during the dot-com boom, I had a really low opinion of graphic designers due to my interfacing with them
right.
as a Kinko's employee.
Yeah.
It was always, quite frankly, jerks with black turtlenecks and black leather pants who had very high opinions of themselves. It wasn't until, I lived in the Bay Area for a couple of years and then moved up to Portland, Oregon, and there I met some of the first nice graphic designers in my lifetime, and one of them offered me some freelance work, and that's how I discovered graphic design. And that's when I became interested in graphic design proper. I was thinking about going back to school, and it was either urban planning and architecture or graphic design. And
wow.
Graphic design it was. So,
I mean, it's interesting that, because one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, so we'll kind of come back to this a little bit later, is it seems like so much of your work is kind of revolves around self-publishing or self-generated content. So it's interesting that that was kind of there for you from the beginning.
Yeah, and I'm surprised actually that I'm still doing it, because there were a number of years that I thought I outgrew it, but oops, apparently not.
Right.
So, yeah.
And so were you, I just want to kind of, pull some things out from that just for a bit. As a kid, or as you're kind of growing up and as you're in the Bay Area working at Kinko's, were you kind of through that whole time, making things and kind of publishing things on your own, and were you kind of writing all through this time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. During that time in the 90s, there was a pretty big boom in more personally oriented zines and self-publishing.
Right.
This spun out of the mail art movement of the
Right.
80s.
Okay.
And just things that were leaning more toward expression, some fiction, some comics, some just memoir, just kind of like I think the writing that I do now is very much an extension of that. It's like kind of like pop memoir, but now there's the design criticism part of it
Right.
built in as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
So
it's interesting hearing that, and I feel like so much of your current work and writing suddenly makes a lot more sense.
right on.
And it kind of all comes together. So when you decided to go back to school, is that when you went to Cal Arts?
No, I went to Portland State University for my undergrad, and I've been I dropped out of school, but I kept going to different community colleges in California just because I was interested in learning, but I wasn't ready to make the deep dive yet.
Right.
So I had a bunch of credits and then went to Portland State to finish up my undergrad. And that's where I learned, the rudimentary stuff about graphic design.
Okay.
While simultaneously working at a couple studios.
And then what were you thinking or feeling at that time? Did it feel like suddenly all this stuff that you had been doing, that now you had a name for it, or that it made sense, or did this just seem like a continuation and it wasn't this kind of drastic, like, oh, I'm making graphic design?
It felt different because at that point in the late 90s, there was this focus on professionalization, and what we were taught in school was to make, shiny things for Nike as opposed to things that were more DIY. Basically, internally, it felt as though one had to hide the work that was more independent because it was viewed by graphic design culture at large as being too retrograde and atavistic. People were more interested in, the work of Clement Mock than someone self-publishing their own stuff.
Okay. And so while you're in school, you're also kind of working at some studios. After you graduated, did you kind of go right to work, or kind of what were you thinking was your kind of next step then?
At that point, Portland's economy was really in the toilet. I'd already worked in a bunch of studios adjacent to some of the bigger players in Portland. And I had so I'm working part-time or full-time and freelancing at different studios in Portland while getting my undergrad education.
Okay.
So I felt like I was, at least I had a sense of what the food chain was like there.
Right.
And also, while I was going to undergrad, I was fiercely interested in theory and criticism, and I just didn't get enough of that. So, and I had, I'd already been working class forever, so I got the mechanics of how one might run a studio and worked enough to figure it out.
Right.
So then jumped to LA to Cal Arts for graduate school.
Okay, so this is interesting because that was my next question. I was kind of leading to Cal Arts a little bit, and I was curious how that kind of changed your thinking. But you had an interest in theory and criticism before that, and what started that, or where did that interest come from, or how did you discover that?
I mean, I could really perceive the dearth of writing around graphic design at that time.
Oh,
There were like a lot of the slick monographs, and it's the same thing today.
yeah.
But like really stuff that was cerebral and intellectual, and there just wasn't and still isn't enough of that. So I'm a voracious reader,
Okay.
and Portland has Powell City
Right.
Books, one of the biggest
Yeah.
bookstores in the world, and like I read the whole design section. Like I would go every week and just
Yeah.
read everything. And the library I exhausted pretty quickly.
Okay.
So yeah. So I was just interested in the intellectual capacities, and I had some really great teachers as well who pointed me toward things to read.
And then
So.
is that why, I've talked to quite a few people from CalArts now for this podcast, and just to be completely honest, they've been some of my favorite people that I've talked to, because there seems to be such a interest in criticism and theory coming from that institution. Is that why
Right.
you were interested in that? Why you were interested in going there and studying with them?
Yeah, completely. I applied to a bunch of different schools, but speaking with people at CalArts and going there, I just got the sense that, in essence, most other schools either were kind of sprawling or too open-ended,
Right.
In terms of their course of study, or too kind of myopic.
Yeah.
And like CalArts, in my experience, as I perceived it going in, was about really focusing on rigor, making work that was visually seductive, but at the same time entrenching oneself in history and theory and criticism. And it was very, very, very appealing.
And so when you were there, is that when you had started kind of writing about design, or when did I guess my question is, I don't mean to make it so specific. My question is kind of,
No.
you had been always writing and designing and kind of publishing. When did your writing start to be about graphic design?
I mean, basically, my thesis there was, my first. Actually, I had started writing in undergrad for. I had this really great teacher named Margaret Richardson, who was she was an editor for UNLC magazine.
Oh yeah.
And I had written some pieces for that, and Font Shop had this trade publication called Font,
Oh yeah.
and I had written some stuff for that. But it was more like, just trade writing,
Right.
just like
Right.
Margaret had recognized that, like, oh, here's an undergrad student who's a bit older and can write to spec, basically.
Right.
So,
Okay.
so I was doing that kind of writing. But then while at CalArts, my faculty there, especially Lorraine Wild,
Yeah.
Jeffrey Keaty, Gail Swanland, Louise Sandhouse,
Yep.
Ann Burdick, Michael Worthington, they all pushed me to develop my writing, Jeffrey Keaty especially. And I was just in LA hanging out with him, and like he's just a great friend and mentor and someone I really look up to.
When I'm curious, kind of when you started teaching then, or kind of where that, and I know we're jumping kind of out of order a little bit, but that seems like another big part of what you're doing today, and
Right.
everything else that you're doing seems like you've just kind of always been doing it. And so where did the teaching part come in?
Excuse me. I started TAing, so being a teaching assistant at Portland State, and then at CalArts, I was Gail Swanland's teaching assistant for the senior class, and Jeff Keaty's teaching assistant for the type design class there. And then basically I graduated. I worked in LA for a year trying to figure out what my next moves were, and then I moved to Tokyo and pretty immediately started teaching at Temple University, Japan, in the continuing education department.
Okay.
And that rolled into teaching an undergrad a year later.
Okay. And so this is actually a good place to kind of start talking about the work that you're doing now. So, I'll try to do a quick rundown. Tell me if I miss anything. You are you're a teacher at 2 or 3 institutions.
3,
You run a studio.
Yep.
You write for various publications.
Yep.
you have some sort of publishing imprint thing.
Slash type foundry
So,
slash software venture slash distro.
okay. And I saw that you just started some sort of curatorial practice.
Yes.
Did I miss anything?
I think you got it.
Okay. I have a couple questions just kind of around all of that, and I'm interested in. I don't want this to be over simplified, but I'm interested in kind of the how all of those things fit together for you and how they kind of blend into each other. Do you know what I mean? That's not really a question,
Yeah,
but
totally. It's a question. I totally
Okay.
get it. Or more, it's a line of inquiry.
yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So, how do they all fit together? Basically, there is professional practice in which I do work for commercial and cultural clients, which helps to pay the bills. I very recently became a full-time faculty member at Temple University, Japan, after being adjunct for many years.
Okay.
So that is something that also helps pay the bills a lot.
Right.
But it's really pretty much the same workload as what I was doing before.
Right.
As an adjunct faculty member for a number of years. So those two fit together in terms of my love of, and then also I'm the co-chair and faculty at Vermont College of Fine Arts in the master's program in graphic design, which is a low residency program.
Right.
So there's that, and then I have a small type foundry / publishing company / software venture / distribution service called Wordshape.
Right.
And the way that all of these things, and I also teach at a little like weird typography finishing school, kind of. It's like a Saturday school for typography in Tokyo called Meme Design School. And they kind of fit together. I see that all of this as kind of pieces of the puzzle of my life in terms of inquiry and in terms of kind of the things that tickle my brain intellectually.
Okay.
So I've got professional practice where, because of all the other stuff I have going on, I can be really picky about the work that I take on now for the first time, only over the past 6 months. And that's really great.
Yeah.
So I get to be choosy, no designing brochures for people anymore, which is really exciting.
Right.
Just like, I don't want to do workaday design. I want to do things that are meaningful to me and to people, or things that I just, have a fancy for. So there's that component. The teaching, both at an undergrad level and graduate level, is really complementary in terms of constantly shifting how I think about both, the formal and conceptual aspects of design and the synthesis of such, and being able to to talk to folks that are, who've been practicing for a long time and folks that are just starting out.
Yeah.
And just having, it's really healthy to have a range of people in your life.
Right. Right.
It's like when a lot of people get married, they like hide away from the world and they only hang out with their spouse, and then their life goes to shit.
Yeah.
So there's that. And then the self-publishing, I really I really kind of like doing things the hardest way possible at all times.
Okay.
So, I don't know, like I enjoy self-publishing and publishing a few other people's work, and I really enjoy doing type design on occasion, but it's so rigorous that I don't want to do it all the time.
Right.
Yeah. And then the teaching at Meme Design School, it's teaching in Tokyo and being immersed in a context that is very domestic and not international for the most part.
Right.
And that's really interesting. So it just kind of ticks all the boxes of my life and my interests.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, this podcast kind of, at a high level, the tagline of it is kind of the intersection of criticism and practice. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you is that word intersection doesn't seem like it fits, because it seems like kind of the critical, theoretical side and the educational and academic side are completely in sync with the kind of practice making work that you do. I even liked your website for your studio says that you operate at the intersection of graphic design, design education, and design research. And I like that idea of a studio that encompasses all of those things.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's my hope, is for it to be expansive yet somehow focused.
So I have kind of a random question that's kind of just related to this. It's kind of a two-part question. Just kind of, roughly how much of your work is self-generated versus client-based? And then the second part is, do you find that you approach the kind of formal design work differently depending on if it's something that's self-generated versus something that you're doing for a client?
At this moment, I would say, I mean, like, when we say client-based work, talking about, like, pure studio practice.
Yeah.
Probably, like, I'm teaching 3 days a week at Temple, plus working with my grad students at VCFA, which essentially equates to another day or so a week, except when people are turning their work in. So, studio work is like, see, it's really, so client-based stuff is maybe 30%, because the other thing is, like, studio work for me also involves designing type and we're developing software. Because essentially with designing typefaces, they're a very stable form of software that you don't have to update every time an iOS update comes out.
Right.
So it's extremely stable, packet-based, digital packet-based, royalty-based income. So that's a big part of my studio work. So that basically is about half of my practice, including that stuff.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a long answer. But.
No, that's really interesting. And then do you kind of approach, like, is your design process different, or do you find yourself kind of handling projects differently if it is something for a client versus if it's, a zine or a self-publishing project?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, it's usually a fairly traditional kind of setup when working with clients, often with collaborators, be it, web developers or, people doing production on typefaces with me for client work. So, yeah, that's more traditional. And the aesthetics, I don't know. I think more and more people are coming to me for the aesthetic of the work for commercial work. So I'm able to kind of bring in a certain amount of, like, visual design authorship to commercial work that people are seeking.
Interesting. I want to kind of step back a little bit and talk about the state of design criticism or kind of current contemporary design discourse. And, as somebody who, basically your whole design career, you've also been kind of writing about design. And as I mentioned before we started recording, I listened to the interview that you did with Mitch and Joshua on Through Process, and you were kind of talking about the anti-intellectualism in graphic design. And so I have a series of questions here, but I'm just going to kind of start with something that I hope is kind of basic, and let me think the best way to phrase this.
That's cool.
What kind of design writing are you most interested in doing yourself? And then also, what kind of design writing are you most interested in reading, or that you're most excited about reading today? Does that was a weird way to phrase that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's parse it out. In terms of, is it cool to? So I'm going to flop the questions. First, in terms of reading, there's not a lot of specifically graphic design writing at the contemporary moment that I am very interested in, with the exception of Francisco Laranjo's work.
Oh, yeah.
Randy Nakamura, Jeffrey Keedy, when Lorraine Wild writes something. Right. I mean, those folks are kind of the heavy hitters for me, but there's just not but like it's the like constant stream of blather that comes out on medium.com, most of that I don't look at it.
Right.
Because the thing is, there are basically two kinds of writing in the work. Two types of writing in the world. There's things that are more timely and more timeless, and the format tends to point toward the quality of the work. Medium.com posts tend to be more timely,
right.
Whereas work that is in print tends to be more timeless. And this doesn't mean that I have a bias towards print per se, but if someone, for example, Francisco, believes that the writing of himself and his collaborators is of worth, he makes the investment financially and intellectually to put it in print and to pay money for it. So there's that. And then also, like, just in terms of shelf life as well, when things go in print, people tend to take them more seriously. So the second part, in terms of design writing that I do, there are specific slices of it at the contemporary moment. I'm very interested in analyzing design culture through a critical lens that involves a couple things, primarily political economy, history, narrativity. And when I say narrativity, I'm talking about the things that make a story, but not the storytelling itself.
Oh, okay.
And that would basically be it.
So that's okay. This is now I feel like I need to kind of parse out your answer to ask my next questions. Okay. Talking about the writers that you kind of are interested in, and kind of avoiding kind of the medium, hot take kind of design writing that is so prevalent. I feel like, we're kind of 100% on the same page there.
Okay.
And I am completely with you. I'm kind of curious, do you, I'm sorry, this is another multi-part question, but do you think, one, I guess, what is, and this is going to sound a little bit devil's advocate, and I don't mean it like that, but what is the value that you see in kind of having that kind of rich, deep, timeless, intellectual discourse around the work that we do?
Okay, so first off, I don't think anything is truly timeless. I'm just talking in terms of relative scale.
Right. Yeah,
it's like, a tweet versus, or it's not even a tweet, like a comment on Facebook versus a zine.
Right.
In essence, something that is in print or is published online. Say, I had an exhibition in York, Pennsylvania last year, and I made an essay as microsite. So it's a self-contained entity. So there is a more conscious sense of cultivating the vehicle for the writing,
right,
as opposed to just like blah, 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 blah. There's a whole, basically there's already a medium for it and you can just hit publish.
Right. Yeah.
So, just conscientiousness. And yeah, sorry, does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, and then do you think, I guess that answers it on one level. And then I'm also kind of curious for kind of, the profession at large, do you think, and I realize this is a very general statement, but do you think kind of that kind of deep reading and writing about design, how does that kind of further the profession or help the profession or the value that brings to the actual work that we're making?
So that's the whole thing. I mean, it depends how much value you put on work. Looking at design through the lens of political economy, as I mentioned earlier,
right.
I don't think labor is the end-all be-all, and I don't think the output is the end-all be-all, because essentially designers are usually doing things for other people.
Right.
And most of that is just labor as opposed to something of value. That's the very difficult thing for graphic designers to tease apart, is that sometimes the content isn't worth shit.
Right.
Sorry to be so blunt about it. So often, because, design authorship is often it's about, the surface, but often it's about the means of production and how one enmeshes oneself in social and economic relationships. And that's usually more interesting to me at this point than just, something cool for somebody cool at the contemporary moment.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this reminds me, I interviewed, a month or two ago, I interviewed one of my professors at Micah, Christian Bjornard, who is really interested in sustainable graphic design. And and in our interview, we kind of talk a little bit about, what does sustainable graphic design mean? And I, not knowing much about it, kind of saw it as, quote unquote green design or, kind of, recycling and that sort of thing. And he flipped it and talked about it kind of about, I'm going to get this wrong, but kind of sustainable ideas, or what are the designing around the things that you want sustained. And, he's similar to you in that he teaches and can be very selective with his projects, but it's talking about like, sometimes I get a project and it's not something that, I think has value or something that deserves to be in the world. And part of my job is saying, why are we doing this? And that raises a lot of interesting questions about criticism in kind of moving it beyond form, aesthetics, and the object, and start talking about, I think this is very much in line with the kind of writing that you're talking about. Why does this exist? What is the culture that this was born out of or put into?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, there's been a real dearth of different approaches to to graphic design criticism in, the past decade. Because, between the imagined past, the experienced past, and our hopes for the future lays a very precarious present in which we're enthralled in entertaining and being entertained so much so that we're losing our ability for discussion beyond 140 characters per tweet.
Right.
There's a writer and artist named Martha Rossler, and to paraphrase her, she said, celebration and lifestyle mania forestall critique. A primary emphasis on enjoyment, fun, or experience precludes the formation of a robust, exigent public discourse. Something like that. Essentially, reasoned criticism has been supplanted by the medium.com pseudo op-ed piece without editor, publisher, suitable publication, a Facebook post.
Right.
And even, how things like the Sunday New York Times has morphed from being a news publication into essentially a self-contained style section with a thin news wrapper. People want experiences, the contemporary populace wants their H&M and their Disney Time Warner controlled New York City theme park, Union Square, and their simulated city as entertainment shopping complex with smooth English language transactions at exotic tourism destinations with Thai and Mexican food options, and an Oculus Rift at hand at all times, and the absolute right to broadcast whatever they want to say, whenever they want to say it, without thinking about it too much.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry to get dark. But
no, I mein,
you're the reality of the contemporary moment.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I'm curious. I've been trying to kind of get out of the American design discourse, and I'm curious, being in Tokyo, is it similar or kind of what is design writing like?
Similar but different. I mean, Japan and the US have similar histories, but they're different. That's one thing that graphic design as an area of cultural production has never come to terms with, is that there are divergent modernisms and postmodernisms globally. It's something like, almost nobody has poked a stick at that. And, I've lived in Japan for coming up on 13 years, and it is just, the history is different. What we perceive of as the canon of graphic design history is different. And I'm really lucky. I write for Idea magazine, which is Japan's oldest graphic design magazine. And the editor of Idea, Kiyanori Moroga, he writes at length about that and is an amazing collaborator and person who encourages people to write critically about the contemporary moment. And he's essentially writing the history of Japanese graphic design through the magazine itself.
Oh yeah, that's great. I'm only kind of partially familiar with Idea. Every now and then I'll see a kind of PDF scan of an article that's been translated, and so far everything that I've seen from them has been amazing.
Yeah, I mean that's a thing, because if you're, I highly recommend going to the library and looking at as many as possible. Okay. I mean, that was, seeing Idea magazine for me when I was living in Portland was one of the things that greatly shifted my trajectory as a designer. Oh, wow. It offered everything that the U.S. design press didn't and still does not to this day. Yeah. Both in terms of form and like just like printing. Like each issue had 5 to 20 different paper stocks and finishes and tipped in booklets and posters. Yeah. But slick, not like Aesopus magazine or something that feels like it's nice and expansive, but the production quality is a little bit low rent. Yeah. Idea was just amazing, and it's still amazing, and that it's been around since 1953.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And with it was a kind of crabby trade rag in the 80s for the most part. Yeah. But throughout the late 90s and early 2000s till now, it's just been a phenomenal publication.
Yeah, that's great. And so how often are you writing for them, and are you kind of pitching stories, or are they coming to you with things that they want you to write about, or how does that work?
It's a mixed bag. Basically, I'll pitch some stuff. Moroga-san, the editor-in-chief, he'll ask me to write stuff. I'll help out with some copy editing here and there. Okay. I'll design some stuff. It's just kind of like when they want me to do things, or I don't know. He and I co-curated the study room, kind of like the reading room at the Brno Biennial in the Czech Republic.
Oh yeah.
And he and I and a really amazing designer from Osaka named Tetsuya Goto, we put together a whole feature about the Brno Biennial, but also about the history of graphic design exhibitions globally and in Japan.
Oh, interesting.
So, it just really depends on the issue, the topic, and he and the staff at Idea know that I'm just down to help out with whatever.
Right.
They're the best. They're the most chill, cool people.
That's so awesome.
So,
who
are fierce critics. So.
Oh, I mean, no, and that's the best. That's the best way to be too. I have just a couple questions, just to kind of wrap it up and kind of tie some of these things together. Okay. I'm interested. You started answering this a little bit, and this is a question that I ask everybody. But I'm curious, kind of, what are the topics or issues that you think designers should be kind of talking, writing, thinking about right now?
Okay. Essentially, maybe the thing to do is to talk about I'm thinking. So, okay, actually, there are certain. All right, this is gonna be a slightly long answer.
Go for it.
Basically, I started teaching at Temple about 6 months ago. I started teaching my first lecture courses that are a combination of art and design history and Asian studies classes. So they're lecture courses. They're outside of just being a purely graphic design situation. So one of the classes I teach is called Japanese Arts in Cultural Context. And what I've been doing is trying to tease out what are the big things culturally and societally that people are interested in right now. Things like authenticity and things like retro culture, and trying to provide the students with reading about those things from the contemporary moment and how those ideas fit into conceptions of our past. And that's one thing that designers don't do enough, is to really look at culture at large in terms of ideas like authenticity, because I was talking about the experience economy,
Right.
and essentially that is authenticity as we've constructed it right now.
Right.
What we consider authentic at the present moment has very little to do with a historical sense of being truly genuine or historical.
Yeah.
Instead, it's how experiences feel to us. It's a style of experience as opposed to being evidence of an experience having an origin. So, and that comes because claiming authenticity, there's a writer named Sharon Zukin. She wrote about it. She basically said claiming authenticity is prevalent when identities are unstable and people are judged by their performance rather than by their history or innate character.
Yeah.
So, like those kind of big ideas. And at the same time, criticism is often stalled at a surface level.
Yeah.
Because people are afraid of poking others. So like if you look at the work of, say, Metahaven.
Right.
Metahaven's work has a historical lineage and at the same time, those folks seem very hesitant to talk about why their work looks the way it does.
Right.
So folks are afraid of poking others at the contemporary moment because, it's all about how things feel as opposed to getting deep and talking about why things are the way they are. So it's about power constructs and getting people out of their comfort zones.
So for that lecture class, you've hit on something that I've been thinking about a lot in the last couple months, and I think bringing up Metahaven even, connected this to a couple other things that I had been thinking about. At those lecture classes, and I guess even, kind of any of your classes, how do you kind of talk about this stuff in a classroom setting, or how do you get your students to think about the work that they're doing beyond a surface level? And the reason that I ask that is because, talking about Metahaven, something I've been thinking about a lot is how that sort of Metahaven style has become the kind of default for designers who want to see themselves as like critical designers or, kind of design fiction designers. And now that's just an aesthetic trope, kind of because Metahaven, kind of has done that. How do you get students to kind of think about these things or to kind of move beyond these things or think about form as a, container for ideas instead of just that surface?
That's the really nice thing about working with both undergrads in Tokyo in a fairly international environment, as well as grad students in the U.S. It's a pretty wide sampling. Like most undergrads at Temple, Japan have no idea who Metahaven is or have a sense of, what Jeffrey Keedy has called the global style.
Right. Yeah,
they're just kind of like coming to it through looking at Pinterest. So they're just kind of looking at everything and they can't tell what's like, quote, good or not good.
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of like going through and categorizing. All right. So this is like, the current American, little bit country, little bit rock and roll, Lester Beale meets Aaron Draplin down at the Parisian Cafe, So like there's that. And this is how, if you want your stuff to look goofy and theoretically academic, you do this. If you want your work to seem insidious and critical, this is how you do that. And just really parsing out style, but then talking about histories and where they come from with the work. And yeah, same thing with the grads. And it's really hard because most graduate students come to graphic design with they just have more experience in terms of analyzing aesthetics and why things look the way they do. And you can just talk about it on different levels with them and encourage them to make work that either looks or operates in ways that are hopefully different than others.
Right. You had mentioned that I'm kind of going back to our discussion a little bit earlier about design criticism and how there's not a lot of current design criticism that you're reading these days.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested, are there other fields or other disciplines or writers writing about other topics that you find yourself turning to and, either applying to your design work or seeing the way, a critic looks at something, kind of wanting some of that turned to graphic design?
Yeah, totally. So first off, what I would say is there isn't a whole lot of graphic design criticism with a lot of the proverbial meat on the bone there right now. So it's not about me trying to ignore things. As I mentioned, I read a lot. Right. So I do go out and I read as much as possible, but stuff that has a lot of worthwhile content is not out there yet It's just not out there because folks aren't trying that hard. And that kind of falls back. It's kind of the fault of the academy because graphic design education, like historically and in the contemporary moment, like what is a graphic designer? Right. So you've got your email designer, you've got your, you have to get motion graphics in there. You got to get your multimedia in there, aka UI UX. So the thing is, graphic design is spread through so thin and that it's really hard for academic institutions to put a real focus on theory and criticism. I was just in LA hanging out with Jeffrey Keedy and paraphrasing things that he said right here. So there's that. And then in terms of reading, so like my undergrad minor was in political economy. So I read a lot of stuff by there's a writer named Joseph Heath that I like a lot. He writes about communicative action and morality. So I read a lot of critical Japanese history of design and culture by people like Andrea Germer and Jennifer Weisenfeld. Then cultural reading. I'm a giant fan of Svetlana Boym's writing about nostalgia and the artist, critic, and educator Martha Rossler. She wrote a really great book called The Culture Class. So it's, really sprawling, but then like stuff that's a bit more speculative, like Evan Calder-Williams writing about, he calls it salvage punk, basically, how we're headed toward, from a moment of precarity into something that's far more scary in terms of late capitalism. Yeah. So. Oh, interesting. Yeah. And then like weirdo fiction. I don't know. I like reading a lot and I like writing and I like processing through that and making stuff that is more experimental in terms of installation work that kind of folds, like type design and writing and visual form together with found objects and some sound, etc.
That's so interesting. It leads into kind of what I wanted to ask you next, and I feel like I feel like we're very similar in that regard, where I just, if I could, I would just read all the time, and I'm very committed to the kind of process of writing and spend a lot of time trying to become a quote better writer, or better articulate my thoughts through writing, and then combining that with the kind of design work that I do. And that that kind of leads into this kind of final question that I wanted to talk to you about just a little bit. Was I think it was a year or two ago you came out with a small zine that I think was called something like Start Somewhere, and it was about kind of encouraging designers to write, or helping designers to start writing. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm curious kind of the origins of that project, but then also on a larger sense, why you think that it's worthwhile for designers to write, or kind of the value of bringing writing into the design process.
So the history of that came from, years and years of writing, but then also, I only feel like I hit my stride as a writer in the last maybe 5 years. Oh, okay. And so just kind of the subtitle of that was something like, like, it was a handbook of dubious tips, tricks, and rants about becoming a designer who writes.
Right.
And it's just about the process of writing, because nothing scares the pants off designers more than generating their own content.
Yeah.
And that could be visual, it could be written, and then synthesizing the two. That's incredibly hard, because designers, usually all those jobs are parsed out for different folks, and to kind of do it all yourself is daunting.
Yeah.
And it's more to, like, just to encourage people to do it, because ultimately writing for me is something that's very cathartic. I'm not, you always see the movies, like movies where, you've got like some writer who's got a deadline for their draft of their novel, but they've got writer's block and they're freaking out. And that's like the premise for, like, tons and tons of movies.
Right.
It doesn't have to be like that. You can just write, and it makes you feel better. And it makes the world more relatable, because ultimately you get to know yourself better at the same time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, like, it's just like, I mean, it really, that came out of teaching a lot of the time, because I just tend to say a lot of the same things. And at VCFA, I've been involved with the faculty in writing our student handbooks and thesis guidelines, and a bunch of the ideas for that came through writing essentially the thesis handbook with my fellow faculty, and just, how to start writing. I was like, I got back from my residency, and I was like, that is interesting. So I'm working on, I put out one follow-up to that about, it's this little zine called Coloring Inside the Lines, Coloring Outside the Lines, about, it's basically advice for design grads who just got out of undergrad.
Oh, cool.
And then I'm about to release a new book called Cannibals, and it's a handbook of dubious exercises, tips, and rants about becoming a designer who teaches.
Oh, interesting.
So that'll be out hopefully within the month.
Oh,
have
great.
to do one last proof today. But, like, just, there are a lot of things about design that people are interested in. It's just designers usually spread themselves so thin, both in terms of work and then their personal lives, because people are working more than ever, and everybody feels like, you have to have everything. Right. And I don't want to have everything. I don't want to have kids. Like, I want to just focus on the stuff that I want to do, and I want to eat well, and I want to drink well, and ride my bike and go swimming. Yeah. And teach and, like, do this expansive practice, but I want to enjoy myself and not spread myself so thin. Yeah. Despite everything I said.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. I feel like that's, it's such a perfect way to actually kind of wrap all of this up, because I feel like you very much are, as somebody who's kind of followed your work from afar and now talking to you for the last hour or so, you seem like you're someone who very much kind of practices what you preach, and that you are kind of doing all of these things and you're following your interests. And it's so great to just kind of watch what you're doing and kind of see this stuff that you're doing. And so I try to read everything that I can that you put out, and I've enjoyed this conversation so much. This was so fun. Thank you so much, for talking with me.
Thank you, Jared. Oh, I appreciate it as well. Thank you.
This episode was recorded on June 5th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.